Asking Better Questions, How to Help Your Students Get the Most Out of a Case with the Global Business School Network, presented by Greg Merkley of Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. The Global Business School Network is a nonprofit organization that is based in Washington, D.C., and we work to address the severe shortage of management talent in the developing world by harnessing the power and expertise of a network of leading business schools around the world. We engage in network promotion, in knowledge sharing, in webinars like this one, as well as in capacity building programs that use our network to improve the capacity of management education institutions in the developing world. We have at current date 53 member schools of the GBSN, and they are from 26 different countries. If you would like more information about being a member of Global Business School Network, please check us out online, or feel free to email us at info@gbsnonline. This webinar is a part of our second annual Case Method Month. This is the second of 3 webinars on case teaching that we will be presenting this month. The next one will be next Thursday on the 4 mistakes that case teachers make. And there is a recording from last week's webinar that was on online case teaching. We also have had a series of guest bloggers from around the world talking about how to write an effective case, the experience of case writing and case teaching. I encourage you to check out our blog and see what they all have to say. We also have lots of resources for free cases, for information on how to write and teach cases, on student competitions, on case writing competitions. All sorts of things are on the website, so please take a look and use us as a resource. If you have a resource that you would like to share with us, we are always looking for more. We want to be as robust as possible, so please feel free to email that to us. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Greg Merkley. He is the manager of case writing at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He is a graduate of Kellogg as well, and spent much of his career in the corporate and entrepreneurial settings before returning to Kellogg, where he collaborates with faculty to develop case studies that are used in courses at Kellogg and at other business schools around the world. Before this, during his career, he consulted with global companies to help them implement successful strategies in the Japan and Asia Pacific, and he's taught MBA and undergraduate courses in strategy, marketing, and organizational behavior at Concordia University. So we are pleased to have Greg Merkley. I apologize, I don't think I've introduced myself yet. My name is Paige Buchanan. I work for the Global Business School Network, and I will be moderating our conversation today. So with that, I would like to hand the bar over. Actually, we will do a quick poll before I hand the bar over to Greg to ask you a little bit about your experience case teaching. So if you would take a moment to let us know what your experience with case teaching is. Are you a brand new case teacher? Have you just started? Are you getting going? Or is this something that you've been doing for a very long time? So I see we have quite an interesting mix. Okay, I'll give you just a couple more seconds to vote, and then we will close the poll with a couple more people to vote. All right, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. And as you can see, we have quite a mix, pretty even actually, of about a quarter of you have never actually taught cases before, a fifth are brand new, and then a quarter a little bit of experience, and then some of you are quite experienced with case teaching. So with that, I will hand it over to Greg. And
Okay.
Greg,
Yes, thank you, Paige.
you're welcome. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are. It's a pleasure for me to be able to speak with you today on a topic that I really enjoy. And so thank you for taking time to be a part of this presentation of the Global Business School Network. As Paige mentioned, I am responsible for writing cases at the Kellogg School of Management. Just to give you a little sense about our case experience, we have to date published over 300 cases, along with associated teaching notes and other material. And last year we sold a total of 135,000 of these cases to other universities who use them with their students. So if you're one of those who uses Kellogg cases, we thank you, I thank you. If you don't use Kellogg cases, I certainly invite you to have a look at our collection either on our own website or the Harvard Business Publishing website. All of our cases have been taught in Kellogg classes, and I actually have observed personally many of those as they have been taught. As Paige mentioned, I'm also a Kellogg alumnus and instructor, so I may have something of a unique point of view when we discuss cases and how they're taught. Today's topic really came out of a workshop that I recently moderated with our faculty when we were talking about case discussions. We had identified what we thought were three essential skills to effective case teaching. They were asking questions, listening, and responding to the students. And we felt that although all three of those were important, the asking questions had to come first, because without good questions, no amount of listening, no amount of responding could really create the kind of learning that we thought cases can offer. So because I think that asking questions is such an important part of a good case discussion, I want to first take just a minute and review the characteristics, what I believe are the characteristics of a good case discussion. This, in my opinion, will not only help you identify when a good discussion is occurring, which I think is important, but it will also help you target the kinds of questions you ask. You can ask questions to address the aspects of discussion that are most important to you, or perhaps the areas of your discussion that you may most feel need the most improvement. Now, of course, this is only my view about what a good case discussion is. If you have different ideas, then as we talk about different types of questions, you may want to change the types of questions that you ask based on your view of how you want the discussions to progress. One of the important differences, and perhaps the most important difference between a case discussion and a lecture, is the dominance of the instructor. As we all know, in a lecture, the instructor really dominates both the content of what's delivered and how it's delivered. You know, he or she decides what's taught, the order in which it's taught, and how it's taught. And probably the most visible sign of that is the proportion of the class time that the instructor is speaking, which usually approaches 100%. However, in my view of a good case discussion, the instructor does not dominate. Of course, the instructor is the one who's responsible for planning the main points that need to be learned, but the students have significant influence through their participation. They can influence what order things progress and exactly how particular topics are addressed. However, there can still be a lot of variation within that. If on one extreme you might say that the traditional Harvard model of case teaching might have the case instructor speaking as little as 20 or 30% of the class. But even if you vary from that, I believe that most effective case discussions have the instructor speaking less than half of the time. The second point in a good case discussion is that it's also not dominated by a small number of student participants. I believe that the classroom experience of case discussion is much better for all students when there is broad participation. The standard class period at Kellogg is 90 minutes, so that in a very active, effective case discussion, that may involve anywhere from 25 to 40 different participants during that 90 minutes. Now, for one thing, broad participation ensures that there's a broad variety of viewpoints that get heard. But I think just as important to that, it helps students to feel that they're involved in the discussion even when they're not speaking. And to emphasize a little bit more on that, when the participants are not just volunteers, but they include also some thoughtfully cold-called students, we find that that creates greater motivation for students to prepare. The third aspect of a good case discussion is students talking and listening to each other. Now, all other things equal, having a lot of students participate is preferable. But unless they're actually listening to and responding to each other, the discussion is less of a discussion and more of a string of unrelated comments. And I think another trap to avoid in having a good case discussion is having the instructor involved after every single student comment. This can come to resemble a game of ping pong or tennis, with the instructor asking a question, a student answering, and it gets repeated over and over. So that there's part of the instruction needs to be for students to learn that listening doesn't mean just sitting quietly while they're thinking of what they're going to say next. Now, one reason why I think case discussions can be so enjoyable and so effective is because they create a lot of energy. As students get engaged with the material and the process, they become more excited and more invested in the topics that are being discussed. Of course, that creates a challenge for an instructor, which is generate enough excitement that the class is engaging, but not so much that it gets out of control. Finally, since the discussion of a case has an educational purpose, no matter what else happens during a discussion, I believe it isn't successful unless the students are actually learning something. Now, of course, it's possible that the discussion develops in a way that emphasizes some of the planned learning points more than others. It may even introduce a new point that wasn't part of the planned learning objectives. However, the discussion is only successful when students learn something useful as a result of it. Just to talk for a moment about learning, I recently spoke with Professor Dorothy Leonard of Harvard. She, some years ago, had authored a paper with Brian DeLacy that discussed different ways of learning. Now, of course, there's many different studies on this topic, but this one I thought was particularly applicable to case discussions. They identified the most basic way to learn as rehearsing and repeating. Now, this is how I learned, and maybe many of us learned things like basic facts, like our alphabet, or simple multiplication. This is rote learning, a lot of effort, rehearsing, repeating over and over. Fortunately for us who either do case discussions or would like to, this is not part of what we do. A better way to learn, according to Professor Leonard, is organizing facts through analysis. That can use frameworks, it can use different kinds of concepts. Information learned in this way tends to be more durable. The learning tends to be more durable than just the rote memorization type of learning. Now, this is where case discussions start to become effective. There's lots of opportunities to focus on applying frameworks and concepts, and the discussions can be really helpful in cementing that learning and helping students to understand the subtleties of the concepts and the kinds of questions that we as instructors ask can play a big role in helping them to effectively organize their learning. But according to Professor Leonard, even better than organization learning is discovery learning. Now, of course, this should be a very important part of what we do in asking questions in case discussions. Cases are designed to simulate real-life experiences. So the objective is to help students discover for themselves important concepts rather than just organizing them. So we'll discuss later what different types of questions that can help students in this discovery process. Finally, Professors Leonard and DeLacy said that what they believe is the best kind of learning is what they call, alternatively they call it wisdom, or they call it deep smarts. And the process they talk about as being aha. And this is an active type of learning as they describe it. When a student may initially be confused or not understand, then struggles to make sense of the information, and in the process of creating alternatives, finally gets a moment of insight into the answer. And questions can help create this during a case discussion. Now, just to share with you one example of this type of learning that Professor Leonard presented, think about for a moment what this phrase describes. The house was small when the sun came out. The house was small when the sun came out. Now, I haven't really given you perhaps enough time to go through the entire aha process, but perhaps this will help. Okay, this phrase describes an igloo. Because it's made of snow and ice, when the sun comes out and shines on it, it will get smaller. So that's a very trivial example of what we hope students, that we can encourage in our students with our questioning skills. So now let's turn our attention to the questions themselves. I look at questions as the most important tool, as I said, for an instructor handling case discussions. Now, if you've ever shopped for a knife like this, either a Swiss Army knife or some other multi-tool pocket knife, you know there's many different kinds of models available. Now, the models that have more tools enable you to perform more tasks, or at least perform the same tasks better, more efficiently, more easily. That same thing is true of questions in discussions. Now, I find for myself and the colleagues here at Kellogg that I have worked with, most of us are good at formulating certain types of questions. So for the rest of our presentation, I want to focus on expanding the number of tools that we have in terms of the types of questions, the number and variety of questions that we can ask during these discussions. Now, of course, there could be many different ways to organize questions, but I will present my particular organization scheme, my typology, if you will. So my first group of questions, I really have three major types of questions. My first group is what I call specific questions. These types of questions tend to increase student involvement and energy, and they can kind of heat up the discussion, if you will. So very specific questions that are based in the specifics of the case. Now, for much of the rest of the presentation, the information that I have here has been adapted and modified from a book by C. Roland Christensen, which is called Education for Judgment. I certainly recommend that. Particularly, there's a chapter or two that focus very closely on cases and asking questions. So let's talk about the types of specific questions. The first I call diagnostic questions. These are asked to try to identify the source or the cause of a problem. So as listed here, some examples would be, what is your analysis of the problem? What conclusions did you draw from the data? So you'll notice that even though it's specific, to the case, it's open-ended. So it doesn't have a simple yes or no answer and requires more explanation. That is generally what is desirable for discussion, generating discussion in a class. So first, diagnostic questions. Informational questions can be thought of almost as the extreme opposite of diagnostic questions, because usually they are closed-ended. There's a right answer, or there's a simple answer, yes or no. Now, given what I've just said, you might wonder why you would ever want to ask a closed-ended informational question. I said that a closed-ended question when I said that the open-ended ones are better for generating discussion. Well, think back to the poll that we asked at the beginning today. That was a closed-ended question. My purpose in asking that was trying to gauge the audience. You could do the same with your class at the beginning, in the middle of or the end of a case discussion. You could, in a sense, take a poll about different positions. If there's a decision to be made in the case, you could use this type of question in that sense. They also can be appropriate when case facts are unclear. Perhaps they're presented in the case through different speakers in a biased way, and you want to create a shared understanding among all the students in the class. Informational questions can also be useful when you want to help students discover that what seems to be an obvious simple answer might be incorrect, or maybe at least incomplete. For example, the example that's listed on the screen, which product line is most profitable? If you were discussing a case about overhead allocation, you may ask that question. There may seem to be a simple answer, but if you were to examine different ways of allocating corporate overhead, those might yield different answers, so that it turns out that one of the learning points is that it's not so easy to say which product line is the most profitable. Now, one comment I'll make, or give one caution about informational questions, is that asking too many of them, particularly too many consecutively and too many in the early part of the class, can really be a little boring, can lower the energy level, unless you invite some disagreement or you have some sort of a twist like what we just discussed with the question of profitability. Our third type here is action questions. Now, if your experience is like ours here, many students are eager to show off analytical skills during case discussions. Now, this could be appropriate if the case is really designed to help students apply an analytical technique such as net present value, cash flow, discounted cash flows. But for a case that requires a decision or a more subtle discussion, it can be distracting if it isn't connected to a decision or an action. So these types of questions, such as, if someone presents an analysis, what kind of decision would that analysis support? What needs to be done? How should the company do this? Help focus students on decisions and actions really as the focus of their analysis, rather than just playing with numbers. Now, priority questions might be considered a subset of action questions. I'm sure that every one of you has had an experience like this. You've asked a student what to do to, let's say, turn around a failing business. This is the case study. The business has a limited amount of cash, so it has a limited amount of time. And when asked, the student gives a list of wonderful initiatives. But to do all of them would take decades and take many times the resources that the company has. These kind of questions about sequence and priority help students to think more critically, so they can go past simply identifying actions that are beneficial and create some value, and identify which are most important, or which must come first in a sequence. Now, as students learn to recommend actions, they also need to learn to predict potential responses. Oftentimes, the responses are relative to whether those actions are successful, or whether even subsequent actions could be feasible. So these are especially useful in situations that are competitive, situations like negotiation. So in a situation that may have to do with pricing, it might make sense for a student to recommend that a company lower its prices. So asking prediction questions about how the competition will respond will be critical to students understanding the outcome of the pricing action or even the advisability of undertaking that action in the first place. And our last type of specific question here I've termed hypothetical. These kinds of questions really extend the opportunity to apply concepts. Typically, the students will apply them to the facts in a case. Asking a hypothetical question actually helps them create another set of facts to which they could apply the concepts that you're discussing. For example, we have a case on Enterprise Rent-A-Car. They have a strategy of setting up thousands of small off-airport locations all around, particularly the United States, but around the world as well. We could ask a question, hypothetically, how would this strategy work for a competitor like Hertz? Well, asking that starts to help students identify key success factors in that strategy that otherwise they might overlook if they're just applying it to the facts of Enterprise. Okay, so those are some specific questions. Now my next category is perhaps obviously some general questions. They have a different effect on a discussion. The specific ones, as I said, they tend to increase the energy and the involvement. General questions, they increase the level of abstraction. You're not talking quite so specifically now about the facts of the case. This tends to slow down the discussion a little bit and enable the students and the instructor to focus on some broader issues. Now, 4 types of these questions. We've already talked a little bit about open-ended questions that don't have simple yes or no answers, require more explanation. Now, these can be very useful, perhaps to start a discussion. These can give you an opportunity to see what the class is interested in discussing, what's most important in their minds after they've prepared the case. So, so that can be a way to begin. Where shall we begin? What are your reactions to the case? They can also be useful for transitions. So if you've spent enough time discussing one topic, you could ask an open-ended question like, what else should we consider in this situation? Now, helping students tie ideas together is another important learning objective in many courses. This is where relationship questions can help. Another one of our cases is 20 years old, about the Philip Morris Tobacco Company. They developed and were promoting a brand of cigarette called Uptown, specifically to poor African American smokers. One of the relationship questions we ask is not how does it relate to other situations we have studied, but in fact we ask students to imagine what other kinds of situations would be analogous to this, this ill-fated effort of the Philip Morris Company. This has led to discussions about companies like McDonald's marketing fast food to children. What's the connection? Marketing a product that is not healthful to a group of consumers that may be viewed as vulnerable. Totally different industry, but the relationship question enabled the students to make the connection between what might appear to be very different situations. Now, in our general question category, shouldn't be surprising, there are generalization questions. These can help our students learn to reason inductively, so to take specifics and to be able to draw more general lessons from them. After one or more cases on, let's say, Apple product innovations like the iPod and iPhone and the iPad, or perhaps technological innovations in a variety of companies, an instructor could say, based on what we have studied, what are the major forces that encourage innovation? These kinds of questions can help students make new connections and to a certain degree help them discover and create frameworks for themselves. Our final type of general question, the kinds that kind of help the students slow down, take a more abstracted view of what they're discussing, are summarizing questions. These can be employed in several different ways. If you've discussed, for example, a complicated situation, before you move to discussing a solution, you may want to ask summarizing questions. Will you summarize this situation for us? They can be used at the end of a major topic, or perhaps more commonly at the end of a class. What you do by asking summarizing questions is give students an opportunity to organize the information that they've heard and to prioritize what they have. Now, our last major category of questions are follow-up questions. In my opinion, the best discussions feature a lot of follow-up questions. Now, this should not just be from the instructor. The instructor should model how to ask follow-up questions, but students should learn to ask these as well. I think that both the asking and the answering of these questions give students opportunities to sharpen their thinking, to refine their position, and they provide a natural way to broaden participation. Because even though we'd call them follow-up questions, they don't need to be asked just to the student who made the original comment. They can be directed to anyone. So I've identified 4 types of follow-up questions that I think can be very useful to improve thinking and encourage participation. Students often can give an answer that is correct, but it may be correct only within certain constraints. For example, a student might say, when discussing business strategy, that differentiation is always the best strategy for a company to pursue. So responding with some kind of an extension question can help students identify any conditions that might undermine their answer. So in the case of the differentiation strategy, an instructor might say, well, does that imply that a company that mines, let's say, potash for fertilizer, that they should pursue a differentiation strategy? And a student would then hopefully be able to understand the distinction that there need to be certain kinds of characteristics in a product that would enable a successful differentiation strategy. Some instructors have been very successful in helping students understand how to undertake case discussions by describing the classroom discussion as the equivalent of a board meeting, where the entire class represents the executive team that is working together and discussing to reach the best possible solution for the company. So preparing students to be effective in those kinds of situations requires that they be able to identify weaknesses in their own ideas as well as arguments that might be used against them. So in a case about posing the question of whether or not to purchase a very costly new security system at an airport, a student who is in favor of the purchase would need to be asked questions to address the fact that some of the benefits of the system are very difficult to quantify. In addition to that, all the decision makers may not share the same perception of the risk of security problems or the costs to the airport of those security problems. So asking perspective questions, whether they're asked to the student who made the original point or to someone else to involve them, can help uncover those different points of view and then help students learn to incorporate those into their thinking and develop a stronger and more effectively presented position. Probing questions. Some students will make only short statements. I don't think the company should expand into Latin America. Probing questions, which are usually open-ended, can help draw them out. Sometimes a short statement like that simply means They're not particularly talkative, and the probing statement will draw them out and help them explain more the reasoning behind what they have said. Or it can also expose if, in fact, the idea is not fully developed. So probing questions will help foster greater student involvement, and then in the future, hopefully get them to offer up more the first time they participate. Now, in my experience, the best case discussions really consist of conclusions or discussions leading to conclusions, not merely exchanging opinions. Challenge questions are effective when students offer up a solution without providing any sort of rationale. So the challenge question gives them the opportunity to share it or helps them to develop one. So if a student were to say, well, I think they should acquire company X in an acquisition case, a challenge question would help him or her explain why. What is the data that supports that? Now, one caution here, we talked about cautions with closed-ended informational questions in the specific question category. One caution here is that too many of these challenge questions, or too harsh a challenge question early in the course, or maybe even early in a discussion, may create a negative feeling among students and could actually discourage them from participating in the discussion. That will depend a lot on school and classroom culture, but you potentially need to be careful about those questions. So to summarize, we've talked about these three general categories of questions: the specific questions, general questions, and follow-up questions. So the specific questions in particular, diagnostic questions, informational questions, action questions, priority questions, hypothetical questions, and prediction questions, those can be very helpful in engaging students. Asking follow-up questions and encouraging other students to ask follow-up questions gives students an opportunity to really test their thinking with their peers, to test their solutions. So we can ask challenge questions, we can probe, we can ask students to extend their thinking, and we can ask perspective questions to help them identify either weaknesses in their own argument or other counter-arguments. Specific questions are particularly good, and hypothetical and prediction questions are particularly good in helping students apply their ideas, first to the facts that are existing in cases, and then with the hypothetical and prediction questions, extending them to other situations to deepen the student's understanding. Now, nearly all questions, and really one of the main points of case discussion in general, is to give students an opportunity to share their ideas with one another, and they effectively become part of the teaching. This, in my opinion, is one of the great differences between discussions and lectures, that students actually share some responsibility to help in the teaching process during case discussions. Questions can be the instructor's way of encouraging that, facilitating that, without necessarily dominating the discussion. Cases are designed to simulate real-life situations. So the more we can use questions to make that simulation more real, to expose the subtleties and contradictions, the more we can create learning opportunities for our students, and particularly those discovery and aha moments that are the most powerful types of learning. Asking good questions of all these different types, getting a variety of questions involved, they can help achieve that kind of learning, which is the kind of learning that will last and can really be transformative in the way that our students perform. So that is the end of my presentation. I have my contact information up here. And certainly if you have questions, since I'm talking about questions, I can hardly refuse questions, but I'm certainly interested. I love this whole topic, and certainly interested in entertaining your questions today, but also following today's discussion. If you want to have additional discussion, I encourage you to contact me.
Well, thank you so very much, Greg. This is fascinating. I actually have a question to get us started. Then we have a couple that have come from the audience already. And that is in preparation for teaching a case. How much of these questions and getting the right mix would you prepare for and say, okay, I'm going to ask these probing questions and I'm going to go with these challenge questions probably at the end. And of course, things are going to move very quickly in the high energy environment of the classroom. But how much of this would you think about and plan beforehand to have in your toolkit, considering there's quite a bit to
Yes.
think about?
There is quite a bit to think about, and if you were to count the number of questions you might ask during a class, again, it's going to be dozens. So I don't think it's possible to plan them all. Not only is it not possible, I don't even think it's desirable, because you run the risk of trying to script the class. And then the students typically can feel when an instructor is trying to push them along a pre-designed path. However, what I would definitely do, I would definitely plan very carefully my opening question. I would try to have a closing question in mind, recognizing that I might need to change it, but I would certainly still have one in mind. And then as I looked at different topics, and I don't want to get too much into the entire class planning, but just sort of think of major topics or major chunks that you want to cover, I would try to think about a few questions within each of those. Look at the different types, think about within each topic a few questions, and then try to think about some transition, maybe a transition question or two. Those might not all get used because you may move through those topics in a different order than you were thinking. But so I would probably, I personally would probably go into a class with at least probably a dozen questions that I've thought of, beginning, ending, a couple of questions on each topic, and then some transition questions.
Great, it's very interesting to think about. We have a question from Joanne Scanlon, who's joining us today, I believe, from Canada. And she says that she teaches online at an asynchronous class site, and they have conferences, but they're not in real time. Students have to type their ideas. Any tips on framing a discussion question about a case that will lead to a better exchange of ideas among the students? Right now, they tend to answer the questions she poses, but don't get into any debates with one another.
That is a good question, and I could see how it would be very challenging. I have to confess I have not done case discussion in an online environment. So unless, I think unless you can build into the norms or perhaps even the assignment in the class to respond directly to others, or in fact to ask questions. And this is thinking of a classroom environment, but some instructors will give students an assignment to prepare questions, not simply distribute preparation questions to which students should come prepared with answers, but ask students, what questions would you ask in this environment? And perhaps there would be a way to incorporate that into an online environment. But again, that's simply my immediate response, and I don't claim to have any experience in that particular type of case discussion.
Great. Well, you have kind of started to answer our next question. I think that we're seeing a little bit of theme. Vanessa Strike from Rotterdam School of Management in the Netherlands asked, how do you encourage other students in the class to ask follow-up questions? I know you kind of started to answer that, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that in the classroom setting.
Yeah, well, again, it is a matter of training, and I'll be honest with you. We have some challenges here at Kellogg as well. One of the, I think, cultural norms here at Kellogg is a strong emphasis on collaboration and working well. Lots of team and group projects. It's been one of the hallmarks of a Kellogg education ever since I went here when we were still, reading cases off papyrus scrolls. And so it is a challenge to get them to, number one, follow up, particularly in a challenging way, to disagree. So some of the techniques we try to use are there people who have a different opinion? Does somebody see things differently? You could, of course, go more generally and say, does anybody have some follow-up questions for that particular point? If you see that there are some, again, either some weaknesses in the argument, some aspects that have not been taken into account in the comment, you can ask the students then, who would like to pose a question? The other thing, going back to one comment that I had made, where instructors really try to frame the discussion as if it were a board of directors meeting. To put that, to say, okay, remember, you're in a board of directors meeting. How are you going to respond? What kinds of questions or comments does that statement generate? This is something that I think takes time, at least with certain students. Some students and some cultures, both national cultures and school cultures, can be very aggressive in engaging in debate, and others are more polite, more deferential. So it does require constant, I think, teaching and reinforcement and really experimenting to see how you can make that work most effectively.
Okay, so our next question comes from Geeta Krishnan from the Indian School of Business, wondering, would the kind of questions be different for an MBA classroom than for an executive education classroom?
That is an excellent question because, as a matter of fact, I was just observing a case being taught in one of our exec ed programs yesterday, and I observed that probably fully 20% of the class was not engaged and attending, and clearly were working on other work-related projects. And that's something that, at least here at Kellogg, we would not tolerate among our MBA students, but executive education is a different matter. I don't know that the type of questions will necessarily be different. However, I think, based on our experience with executive education, the point that was previously raised about people not questioning each other, that sometimes does not happen as easily, and particularly challenging each other. We find that may happen less with executives. The other thing that we notice is that the executives' preparation for case discussions tends to be less in-depth and less thorough. Some of that is just based on the fact if it's a multi-day class, they've only had the previous evening to prepare, as opposed to a few days for an MBA student. So while the type of questions isn't different, I think the mix might be different. There might be a need to, with some information questions and more summarizing, to help the students come to a common understanding of the situation, where with an MBA course, it is probably easier to assume a higher level of preparation and understanding.
Thank you. So our next question is from Julie Goodman. She is with the Peace Corps and is currently teaching entrepreneurship classes in South America, and the students are used to lectures. Students are very hesitant to participate when she asks questions, and wonders if you have any tips for encouraging participation.
Yeah, no, I don't know where she's teaching, but I think part of what she's running into are some national culture issues. And I have, as was mentioned at the beginning, a lot of experience in Asia, particularly in Japan, but throughout all of Asia. And I know that many Latin American cultures tend to be quite deferential to teachers, as Asians are. So I think you have a couple of challenges to overcome here. One is that students are likely to be hesitant. Again, there's of course individual variation here. Not everybody is the same. But generally, they are likely to be hesitant to disagree with or challenge a teacher because of this built-in deference that they have. Secondly, and maybe a little more subtly, the students may in fact resist the notion that they share a responsibility for the learning in the class. That it can actually feel to them like the instructor is not doing their job, but asking the students to do it for them, which won't feel appropriate. So that's just sort of clarifying the problem. The issue, I think, is, number one, understanding it, two, explicitly addressing it in the classroom and saying, I understand this may be your tendency, your comfort, the way in which you're comfortable behaving, but in this class, one of the objectives is to try to develop this kind of skill. And so I am going to ask you to do this. One of the alternatives you might consider, although I think there's a lot of disagreement about the effectiveness, is making this kind of participation a greater proportion of the grade. As I said, there's a lot of discussion about whether that is effective or not, but if you are going to be assessing based on participation, I think need to be clear description of what good participation is, and that needs probably to be a learning objective perhaps in every single class. Just realizing you're going to need to take time to accomplish that learning objective. It's not going to happen naturally, and you'll need to allocate time in your class plan a little differently as you try to coach people through, encourage the kinds of responses that you want, and then gently and productively discourage the kinds of responses you don't want.
It's a very interesting topic and something that we have talked a lot about at the Global Business School Network. I just want to note that Julie did let us know that she is in Paraguay. I don't know if that, if you have any specific
I don't have any specific knowledge there.
Okay. We have a follow-up question from Geeta, wondering, basically saying, you know, the whole Q&A process is hugely educative. How do you capture these learnings for future sessions that use the same cases?
So how do you capture them for future sessions that use the same?
That use the same cases. And, you know, maybe, let's see if we can take Geeta off of mute. Geeta, I'm going to take you off of mute. Maybe you can explain a little bit more what your question is. Geeta, are you there?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Geeta.
Yeah, hi. So what I was referring to is in the process of teaching a case, we do ask a lot of questions and we do get a lot of interesting responses in the class. Are those learnings in some form captured and used in future teaching of those cases?
Are you talking about capturing them for yourself to use?
No, even as a faculty, when I teach the case next time onwards, how do I use these discussions? Or do we use them at all?
Well, I think they are used in a couple of ways. One is, as you teach the case multiple times, you will become more familiar with perhaps the flow, which topics may lead more naturally to other topics. So this is almost a process learning, if you will. Which topics tend to transition nicely to other topics. And therefore, if that's effective in teaching, you may want to pose certain types of questions that will help facilitate that transition. You can also become familiar with the perhaps the kinds of mistakes that students might make in a particular case. If it's a significant mistake, you may want to ask a question that will highlight that early in the discussion, if you want or need to resolve that before handling something else. So if it's a very basic sort of calculation and one of the figures that was in the case could be misinterpreted, you learn that after teaching it a time or two, and you can highlight that much earlier in the case so you can move on to other factors. I mean, I'll give you an example from this case that we used yesterday. It was the first time we'd used it. We used it in an executive education case, and it was about an entrepreneur that had two offers for potential funding of his company. And what the professor did at the beginning of the class is take a poll. Who would vote for venture capital provider A versus company B? And 100% of them voted for company A. So that told us something about the case and how we would either need to revise the case or how we would need to teach it differently. If everybody's in agreement, is there enough tension, or could we create more tension either by modifying the case or by finding ways to turn that around to say, okay, maybe everyone thinks this way, now let's assign half the class to argue for company B as the new partner. So from a process standpoint, I think those learnings can be very useful and can be very helpful to try to record them as soon as possible after the class. As far as the conclusions, again, students, if it's working well, students are likely to say things that we haven't thought of beforehand. And again, finding time immediately following class to note those, perhaps incorporate those into your class plan next time, can be useful as well. Does that address your question?
See, I have muted Gita because we were getting a
you've
little
muted him
feedback
again?
from
Okay.
him. Yeah,
Okay.
I will invite him if he has further questions. You do have Greg's email. It is on your screen. We will be sending you this PowerPoint presentation so that you can have a reference of all the different kinds of questions for your preparation, as well as a recording of the session. I want to thank Greg so much for your time and your expertise. This has been a very interesting study for me, and I hope for all of you too. And I want to thank all of you for participating in our Case Method Month webinar. We will be ending the webinar now. Have a wonderful day.
The organizer